Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you, panelists and the participants from all around the world for this 1 hour session. So thank you to the trialogue team led by Professor François Gray and Thomas Maillard, the chairman of Open Geneva, to give us the opportunity to tackle this emerging topic, blended finance for open innovation and SDGs. So before diving into the discussion, let me introduce myself. I am Laetitia Gill, the Executive Director of the Geneva Center for Philanthropy at University of Geneva. It's an academic center that was launched 3 years ago, and we are a fruit of a solid partnership between University of Geneva and a number of key philanthropic foundations with an international reach. While Geneva is one of the most important global philanthropy hubs, the GCP has now acquired an international recognition for conducting global interdisciplinary research and teaching in this field. And we are currently focused on 4 research topics: diversity in the governance of the non-for-profit sector, why do people give, social entrepreneurship, and taxation and philanthropy. So in the spirit of the trialogue events, we have today around the table a mix of experts from the academia, public sector, and some philanthropists. As you know, we have just 9 years to achieve the SDGs, and it's time, to see how we can achieve these objectives. But also we have to take into account that up to now the SDGs have been underfinanced. So collectively, we need to reconsider how we can do it, in a realistic way. We speak a lot about, finance, and blended finance has emerged, and I will define it in a minute, but maybe there is no official definition, but I will take the OECD ones, which consider that blended finance is a strategic use of development finance for the mobilization of additional finance towards sustainable development in developing countries. So I will now give the floor to the panelists, starting from specific examples of financing for the SDGs to more general commentaries. And we will start with Cherie Nursalim. So Cherie Nursalim, we are very honored to have you on board today, directly live from Bali. And so you have many hats. You are a philanthropist, you are the vice chairman of GITI Group, chairman of the Southeast Asia chapter of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and the Tsinghua, and you also chair the Tsinghua University Southeast Asia Center in Bali. Today, you are going to highlight a new partnership that is launching at the G20 Summit in 2022 in Indonesia, which is called the Blended Finance and Innovation Institute. And this initiative will involve partners from the private sector, social and civil societies, governments, and international organizations. So the floor is yours to present your initiative. Thank you, Cherie.
Thank you very much, Laetitia. So I think, some of you may wonder, why Bali and finance? So, but there's something very profound. So our campus, I think in the background, United in Diversity campus is in Bali, and we are trying to develop a project that is based on the Balinese philosophy of Trihita Karana. So in the screen, you see the 3 is the word 3. Hita is happiness, and Karana are the reasons or the 3 ways to happiness. So the Balinese believe the 3 ways to happiness is the harmony of people with other people. So at the bottom of the happiness pyramid, and harmony of people with nature, and harmony of people with the spiritual. So I think that's aligned with the amazingly serendipitously aligned with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in chronological order. And we are also developing, I think, in order to meet the SDGs, there's a shortfall of $3 to $6 trillion. So I think around that, I think we're working on how do we look at a better business, better world. I think we are working, I think 2018 was the largest finance event of the year, the World Bank IMF meetings in Bali. So with the Indonesian government and many partners, including OECD, WEF, World Bank, international chambers of commerce, many other partners, we have launched the Trita Karana Forum, as well as aligning partners globally to create principles on blended finance. So it's now a global platform, the Trita Karana Roadmap on blended finance. I think Laetitia said try to pick a concrete example. So this is one of the fund that was launched at the event or preceding the event by the government of Indonesia under our able Lady Minister Sri Mulyani, and there is a company called SMI, also run by Emma, Ibu Emma at that time, a wonderful lady executive, and they created this platform, the world's first blended fund. It's called SDG Indonesia 1, and it has de-risking facilities so that it would be more attractive for projects that are difficult to be achieved without a blended platform. So there are multi-stakeholders and partners can come in at different tranches. So, the solutions can link to infrastructure, to women issues, sustainability, and others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cherie, for these concrete examples. And I think it's key to see, that's can be a top-down approach, but also a bottom-up approach. So I will continue with Renaud. So Renaud Vuignier, you are currently the Deputy Head of International Cooperation at the Embassy of Switzerland in China for the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. So you are live from Beijing. But beyond this, your current positions, you are also a public entrepreneur driven by a passion for innovation and impact. And so you are going to talk about the blended finance from the perspective of a governmental funding agency. And you will explain the main activity of the SDC in funding the SDGs and open innovation. Maybe you can present also a concrete example with the Impact Hackathon Asia Pacific with the support of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. Renaud.
So hello everyone. Indeed, so blended finance is a very important topic for us as a development agency, but actually it's also for the whole government a very important topic, because we really have to have a whole of government approach. So it means you have SDC, the agency I represent for development, but we also work a lot with other agencies from the government like SECO, oriented more on economic development and emerging markets, and also a new institution built that is called the Swiss Investment Fund for Emerging Markets. So that's just to say a bit about the different actors. So what is blended finance for us? It's actually, I would say, a learning journey, because it's a big challenge we have, because we have been doing development for long, and we still will keep the traditional aid we provide, and that's a very important thing to really keep and build on what we have been doing. But at the same time, we have to learn about blended finance and how to engage with the private sector, because we really realize that we need to have the private sector on board, because it's very important if we really want to achieve the SDGs. So it means, for example, if we want leverage, we want more impact, we have to have the private sector on board, especially at the Asia Pacific region, also if we want to scale up. And then the reality of those challenges, it's always a trade-off between risk and return. And that's why it's a learning journey, because I think now we have a consensus among all government actors, all private actors, oh, we should cooperate. But then when it goes into the modalities on how to do this, we still have to adapt. And what we try to do is to find incentives to really make sure that we can kind of trigger some investments in the good direction. And the good direction, that's what we as a development agency see as good. It means filling the gap, looking at the vulnerable populations, what is needed, and really try to attract impact investors that are more and more driven for social and impact, but then still they need they need a framework. And that's what we try to build at different level and with different partners, and also of course with multilateral banks and other actors. And I think to give an example of this learning journey, I think the Impact Hackathons Asia Pacific is a good example, because we are working with different partners, especially the Geneva Tsinghua initiative. That's the key actor of this project. So led by the University of Geneva with the University of Tsinghua, where I am based in Beijing, and then also UNITAR and UNESCO. And we are together focusing on having hackathons to improve skills around SDGs, because actually if we want to have an impact, as I talked about before, the blended finance, we also need young innovators. And here I think education has a role to play. And there is also a gap between companies that focus on impact maybe at the end of the spectrum, and young entrepreneurs that are inspiring and inspired with ideas. So with this project, we will organize many hackathons, and we already started in Asia Pacific, in Switzerland, in China, and we'll focus on SDG topics such as health, aging, and disabilities, but maybe also it could then be expanded and have other topics, for example, around climate change.
Thank you. The word of 2022 and 2021 now. So thank you. It's very interesting, and we will come back to this initiative. So, and maybe Nadia Isler will explain us more about another SDG initiative. So you are the director of the SDG Lab from the United Nations office at Geneva. You are based in Geneva. You have a long career in international development with an extensive experience in bilateral and multilateral affairs with and outside the UN system. You have also experience from the field. Indeed, you started your career at Médecins Sans Frontières and the Swiss Red Cross before joining the public sector. You are going to tell us now more, maybe to explain to the audience the SDG Lab. I'm sure most of you know, but maybe not. And then explain the challenges for you of funding the SDGs in general, and how the SDG Lab work to build bridges. I really like this terminology, but to build bridges between the financial and the development sector.
Thank you very much, Laetitia, and thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. And I think it's so difficult to have a meaningful conversation on such a broad and complex issue, but I think I like the way you've kind of given the opportunity for us to come through very different approaches on the mega equation of how we're going to finance, invest, or fund into that massive SDG gap that we have. And so let me just start maybe with some very, very general remarks on our side. As the SDG Lab, you said we are a UN entity, and one of the themes we have been engaging in the past few years has been indeed in SDG financing, because what we felt was that there was this constant sterile kind of ping pong game going between the finance community and the development community. So between people who know a lot about finance but less about development, and those who know a lot about SDGs but maybe less about finance. And we felt that there was really a need there for some actual, as you were saying, bridge building, but that also that bridge building doesn't happen on its own and out of just the goodwill of all these people. And actually what we observed is that you actually need people whose job it is to try and actually build those virtual bridges between those communities, to understand the point that Renaud was making. What are actually the incentives of each and one of those institutions engaging in investing or financing or funding the SDGs? And those are all very different words, right? Funding, financing, investing, they're all different. And that's, to my first general comment, is that we think there is still huge misunderstandings about what we're talking about. And we sometimes take it for granted, if we're coming, for example, from a development expertise side of things, that when I say impact, it is heard or understood the same way when I'm speaking to a commercial banker, for example. But what we actually realize is that my understanding as a development practitioner, impact on SDGs is totally different to what a commercial banker understands by impact on SDGs. So just starting by realizing that there's a huge lost in translation effect often in partnerships that are not happening because we're speaking different languages. And I know it sounds like something that we've heard over and over again, but of our experience, we think we can't underestimate the fact that there is still an abyssal gap in understanding what we actually mean when we mean impact. So that's the first thing. The second one is understanding those incentives and recognizing that we, the finance community and the development community, different things that drive us to engage in this kind of partnerships. They're uncomfortable partnerships because by definition, we're very different, right? Public-private partnerships are not new. Blended finance is not new. These kind of partnerships have been happening for years, but also it's been happening for years that many of these partnerships have actually failed. Many have succeeded, but many have also failed. And oftentimes what we find at the lab as part of our core work is really to incubate partnerships and to nurture those relationships. What we see is that we as a global community don't invest enough in the beginning of a partnership to actually spell out very clearly what are the drivers, why are we in this uncomfortable kind of partnership building situation? Why are we investing time in doing so? And what is success for me and my institution? And what is success for you and your institution? And those two sort of crucial questions in our view take time to be answered and take time to, you need to invest time in that. So you can't just sort of leapfrog that stage of a relationship building and a partnership building. We also think there's a huge lack of trust. So the trust deficiency is still big, although I would say the general conversation has definitely evolved in the past decade. There's more and more conversation, including in the United Nations, about working with the private sector, about working with finance, no doubt, but the trust deficiency is still very much there. And the preconceived ideas on both sides of the spectrum are still very much there. And this is why we created this initiative. We co-created this initiative. We were the sort of the co-seeds of Building Bridges, which is a movement that started in Geneva, and its ambition is to go beyond, where actually we're co-working together between the finance and the development community to try and create products, pipelines, etc., to ensure that capital is actually driven to where it really matters at country level, and not just to be remotely linked to one SDG box, and that we can say, okay, this money has had impact because there's a woman on the board of this business that we're investing in. Okay, that's not enough to have impact on the SDGs, right? So I'm just taking a bit of a amplified, exaggerated example, but this has been the case a lot in the past. So how can we ensure that capital is really driven at country level, where it makes a difference for money and it makes a difference for development? Over to you, Laetitia.
No, it's fascinating. Yeah, thank you. And completely aligned with the Geneva Center for Philanthropy. And I think while SDG is a great opportunity to codify, in fact, we know there is a challenge about language, but at least now when we have these 17 objectives, you know, we can start a dialogue. But we'll come back on the trust, on the language, and on the meaning of impact later on. And that's a very good transition to give the floor to Giuseppe Ugazio about his research topic. So Giuseppe Ugazio, you are the assistant professor at the Geneva Finance Research Institute at the University of Geneva. You are holder of the Edmond Rothschild Foundation Chair in Behavioral Philanthropy, a new topic you are talking about, you are going to tell us more about. And you are an interdisciplinary behavioral scientist, you know, with a PhD in neuroscience and philosophy. So the background is very interesting. And you use this interdisciplinary approach, you know, to probe the affective, cognitive, and behavioral control mechanism that support social decision-making. Maybe also to understand philanthropy, you are developing an AI approach to disclose motivations, to engage in pro-social endeavors, and looking in particular in the role played by emotions and moral values. At least you are the director of the new education program in strategic and operational philanthropy that will be launched at University in Geneva in September 2021. So maybe you can tell us more about your research in education, AI towards SDGs.
Right. Thank you so much, Laetitia, for your kind introduction, and welcome everybody. It's really a privilege to be part of this panel, and it's really a nice opportunity to try to contribute something from the academic and the research perspective to this great work that you're doing. So I've heard a lot of interesting topics discussed before. And one of the recurring things was that there is this huge issue to tackle, education SDGs. This really a large task we have ahead to achieve these SDGs, and that alone we cannot really do much. Yet what we see in philanthropy, what's been called before in the development community and also in finance, it's way too common that we hear about the silos approach, so that every organization, every institution tries to reinvent the wheel and go about trying to achieve this great, to fulfill these challenges on their own. And it's really hard to build bridges. It's great that Nadia's initiative is started to put people together. And so as a researcher, when I joined here in Geneva, I start thinking on how could we contribute with new tools, new ways of facilitating all this, the communication between all these great endeavors, And so one thing that we've started developing is a natural language processing algorithm that's basically using the beauty of artificial intelligence to find patterns in complex sets of data. And we started looking at who is working, who is part of this development community, at least here in Switzerland, but this doesn't need to be limited to Switzerland. Can we identify clusters of areas of activity in which these different members of the community are working, and building a detailed map on which areas are they working? Can we put them in touch? And to facilitate this interaction between them, between these actors, we're also looking at what are the moral values that people believe in when they're working in a certain area? Do we find overlaps in there? And are they motivated by similar emotions and so on? And it's great that Nadia talked about languages. That's one thing that's a difficulty of different fields to talk to each other. That's one approach that we looked at, was to differentiate between donor foundations and operational foundations here in Switzerland. And then we can compare the language used by these two types of philanthropic organizations. And to our surprise, also in between this very approach that should be very similar, there is a lot of different language. And even within philanthropy, operational organizations are talking a different language to some extent compared to donors. So we will move on in the next stage to also consider for-profit organizations to see which areas are they working on. Is there an overlap with non-profit? And to which extent then is the language barrier, how big is this language barrier between not-profit and for-profit? And what can we do once we recognize these language barriers? What can we do to stimulate debate to overcome this? So we're trying to develop new tools that we hope the private, public, and philanthropic organizations that are all working together to achieve the SDGs, they can use these tools to work better together and get a more synchronous approach to achieving the SDGs working together.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Maybe I can start asking you, what are the main areas or SDGs addressed by the philanthropic organizations you could find in your research? So
I found, consistent with also other reports, that at least in Switzerland, but this is also true across the world, that education is the #1 topic in which philanthropic organizations are working. And therefore, the SDG on education, SDG 4, I hope I'm not saying it wrong, is the one that we're tackling most. And that's along with that, we have on the second most worked on topic is health, followed by the arts. Those are the three main clusters of activity that we see to which the philanthropic organizations contribute.
Okay, thank you. It's very interesting because we know that data is a missing piece of the puzzle in the philanthropic sector. And do you see already, some data that could help improve the mapping of activities you are developing?
Yeah, so we built this database that is basically only a collection of mission statements. So it's a lot of sort of the descriptions of what philanthropic organizations are doing. One big part that we're missing, it's knowing how much capital, how much finance is dedicated to each of these endeavors. So we know on the different projects, the areas in which they're worked, they are, but we don't know, how deep are each organizations committed to each of these projects. So from the descriptions, we could find that education, it's worked on by, say, 50% of the organizations, and health only by 10%. But it could be that one of these organizations is contributing, much more capital to this initiative than all the others together. So without that data, it's really hard to say how much people, organizations are involved in their works. So that would be something that could complement very much our mapping initiative, is to know more or less how much money is involved, or how many even resources, not only money, is committed to each of the projects.
Okay, thank you. And I had a question that is joined by participants. We are talking now, the topic of the day, one of them is open innovation. How do you plan to share the data? And are you willing, to open data of your research? So
I saw the question. So it's we are fully committed to open data sets. So we will all our algorithms will be shared with the academic community, but really for anyone on open repositories. Just GitHub comes to mind, is one of the most popular. We really believe in open science. These such complex topics that competition should not really prevent people to share what they're doing, and instead, try to promote collaboration also on that level. And to answer the question, I think there is an interest in becoming more transparent. I remember also it was one of the points that the Lemanic report that was developed by the Geneva Center of Philanthropy in collaboration with its partners pointed to, that we need more transparency. Organizations are committing to it. So people are interested in this. Whether it's not started strongly yet, so we need to do much more on that front, but there is an interest to it. So I'm confident that in the coming years we'll have much more data, and in turn that will really facilitate our task of creating new instruments to help the organizations themselves by analyzing that data.
Okay, thank you. So I have now a question from Cherie, and in fact it's a question from the audience. We have Hafiz, who is a PhD student from Indonesia, but based in Geneva at the University of Geneva for the time being. And the question for you is, based on your philanthropist view, what are the keys to foster productive and sustainable innovation in developing countries?
So I think we are actually just finished on the Tsinghua and Tsinghua University collaboration with Geneva, I think for 5 years, and we have just had a board meeting, and we are about to have the Tsinghua Southeast Asia Center in Bali, and we're just launching our first course. It's an online course. It's called Happy Digital X: Cities, Systems, Products and Services. So the idea is that we are creating a journey and inviting participants from across sectors. This is what I think Nadia on bridging bridges. So I think this is the same. I think we really believe for our foundation has United in Diversity has been working on this for over a decade with MIT and Tsinghua and others. And so we do believe that if you have the right mix of participants, so you have people from the business side, people from the civil society, from academia, from government sectors, from the youth, from indigenous communities, you really have the right mix to solve the local problems. And ours is focused on human happiness and sustainability. So we are building a campus of happiness to solve the sustainable development goals. So I think that's one way to approach it. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Cherie. And speaking about building bridges, I think hackathon is a wonderful tool, So maybe Renaud, can you tell us more, about the hackathon in Asia? How do you see as an efficient tool, and what are the strengths and opportunities, but also maybe the challenges?
Sorry, it's not automatic yet.
Yeah.
So sorry, we identified hackathons as one element that is quite tangible, but that's part of the open innovation as a whole, I would say. And what we realized is, of course, hackathons in itself, it can be just an event, but it can also be really a transfer of knowledge and skills. And that's why we thought, oh, that's a good entry point for open innovation. And we do believe that you have leading universities like Geneva and Tsinghua that have the capacity to do great hackathons, and that's what they are doing, and they don't need us as a development agency to do this. But what we can help is to build with them some programs that will help some other developing countries or in other contexts where they can also benefit from the different approach they have. And that's why we thought, oh, that's actually a great way to promote open innovation for the SDGs. And what we hope to see is really to focus again and again on the skills, because hackathons are an intensive experience as such to learn skills, but also to focus on the content and really have more and more SDG topic tackled at universities. Because if we take the topic of China, like Tsinghua is really part of this trend, you really see a shift in the narrative towards more climate and carbon neutralities, and those are the new topics. But then if you look at the curriculum, it's not yet very developed in terms of SDGs. So China, they really want to learn fast, and they can learn fast, but we think that if we do it with them, we can really spread it at the regional level. And that's the idea behind the hackathons.
Thank you. Back to Nadia, in your previous intervention, you addressed the main reason behind the gap in SDG financing. But why there a need to better use the SDGs as a roadmap for investments, especially with regard of the definition of blended finance I explained earlier in my introduction.
When you think that the SDGs were adopted by 193 countries, right? So by the entire world, and that it kind of translates the way forward that every single country in the world has worked together on the major global challenges of our world, then it seems like there is no alternative than to actually use the SDGs as the roadmap, right? It's not something that was created by the UN or was created by academia. It was co-created by every single country in the world, right? So there is a general agreement across the world, for once in history, that there are 17 global objectives that are intertwined and interrelated, and that if a country, for example, is not fully meeting certain objectives, it will have consequences not only on that specific country, but in an entire region, and oftentimes on the entire world. I mean, let's just take the example of COVID and how difficult it is to roll out vaccines at the moment. We all know that if vaccines don't reach every single citizen in the world that wants to be vaccinated, the problem will remain a problem in each and one of our countries. We can't just ring fence our countries and say, okay, we'll continue to work in isolation from the world, right? So it seems clear that there is so much political support for this agenda. It was thought through and through with very specific targets. It would be such a missed opportunities if the finance community at large, and I think that's a challenge, is the finance community is so diverse. It would be a lost opportunity if we started developing a new vademecum, right? It's there. And the COVID crisis has only amplified the extent to which this agenda is relevant. It touches on all the points that came out so bluntly in this terrific crisis we're all in at the moment. The challenge, though, is that oftentimes the SDGs is seen as a UN agenda. Oftentimes it is perceived by some members of the finance community as just an aspirational, naive agenda, which was defined by some UN bureaucrats. Let's all be reminded that that's not what it is. It's a very actual operational framework that was adopted not only by all governments, but there were a lot of joint consultations prior to the agenda to actually define those objectives. But the difficult thing is impact investors have existed for years, right? This is nothing new, and all the great examples that were given on the panel are excellent examples of how it can be done. The challenge is, how can we scale to another level those different specific good practices? What does it take, and who's missing around the table to actually be able to scale that? And that's also part of our initiative in Building Bridges, is to ensure that around the table, we don't only have The impact investors, we absolutely need the impact investors because they have so much experience in bridging that gap between development, between SDGs and finance. So they need to be there because they speak the languages of both sides. And they need to help us to bring the other members of the finance community on board so that they massively invest while having return, but invest in companies, in endeavors that will really make a difference for the SDGs. And those mappings and those priorities exist. Let's not forget also that countries have defined what their SDG priorities are. Depending on the context, they will be emphasizing certain sectors over others. This has to be the starting point. Or inadvertently, we could be falling in a situation where all the money will be going into sectors where the return on investment is less risky. And inadvertently, we're totally skewing the entire agenda where there'll be massive gaps in other sectors. So this is where also it's really important to use the priorities of a given context through the priorities of stakeholders at country level to make sure that the capital is really driven to where it really matters.
No, I completely agree. And the challenge is to install dialogue, but stay yourself. You know, we don't want the profit sector to be only purpose driven, but put maybe more purpose and non-for-profit organization maybe more connected with the financial sector and to be able to connect. And in this topic, we have a question from the audience, and up to you, you know, who wants to take it. You know, how can we incentivize the private sector to invest into SDGs and development?
Yeah, maybe I think it's a great question, because in this panel about blended finance, I think we really have to see blended finance not as a silver bullet, but as really something very important. But that's part of something bigger. And I think to answer the question, what we need and what we try to do with a couple of projects at SDC, for example, in Bangladesh, is to really work on the different scales. And first, of course, you need to offer opportunities for investors that really anyway not invest if it's too risky, because they want to have a goal for SDGs. So you need to have a framework, and it's something you have to negotiate with governments and also with them, because you know how to have modalities. And I think that's one of the challenges. But for example, one of the instruments we have is some catalytic funding and some funds where we as a development agency agree to pay for impact and to reduce certain risk. And then the investors are attracted. But that's not all. You also need some other programs. And for example, you would need to also make sure that you have capacities from the entrepreneurs and the companies, that they have really integrated what SDGs are in their own business model. And then also to make sure that they measure the impact. Because for example, Bangladesh is a very vibrant environment, and so many people call themselves impact entrepreneurs. But then we have also to make sure that's exactly what we also mean, and that's that's maybe here where the education process gets in. So I would say it's really part of a whole framework, and that's why we have been discussing this for years, and it's still a learning journey.
Just quickly, just on the first slide, because I just love Nadia's call to action on our global village to act on the sustainable development goals. But sometimes it's very hard to explain to people the sustainable development goals. But if you tell them it's about happiness, you know, everybody can relate. And this is, I think it's almost, you know, something that I never expected. And I almost felt that it's sort of, it must have been the universe sort of making this happen. My work with MIT and subsequently with Tsinghua University, we work on systems, has always been about bridging three divides: social, ecological, and spiritual divides. And all this work that we have done amazingly aligns with the SDGs in these three ways to look at the SDGs. And I mean, the three layers, right? The pyramid. And amazingly, it's not just Balinese. The Chinese has this Tian Di Ren. The Muslim has this. Pope Francis has written about this in Laudato Si. And also Hindu, many other cultures and faiths have these three harmonies. And so I think, you know, it is sort of like a way, if I would encourage as many of you to use this, you know, happiness for people is easy to relate to. And it can, you know, harmony of the three, right? So that's one. But then, you know, we created this Trihita Karana based on the Balinese language, which says 3 ways to happiness. But then the going down to, you know, how do we measure? Because for businesses, you need to have measurements, even for countries. I think Lord Nixon and others have written about the 4 capitals. And so maybe that we can talk about separately. But the last slide, I think Laetitia wants to see. I think that one is a concrete example. So in order for blended finance to work, there are many structures. It could be, you know, equity, it could be bond, it could be different structures, but the very innovative approach of the SDG 1 is specific for sustainable infrastructure projects. And they are able to get funding that are not asking for any sort of philanthropic funding or organizations that are donating to help projects with their feasibility, you know. So then that there are also the group that are asking for returns, but at a lower rate, longer term, you know. So the KfW, the ADB, the World Bank, you know, so that's sort of less make it more feasible for some projects that are very long term. And then there are financing platforms for banks and equity funds that are looking for market returns. So in order to crowd in the market, you need for certain projects, and that's why we had to do with OECDs and others, the principles, because we don't want to do blended finance for project that does not need blended finance. This is for those that are really difficult projects that does require facilities to crowd in. You know, for example, I've just been tasked to help with the climate as a special advisor to government on climate in Indonesia, and I think we're looking at, for example, geothermals. That's one area that, you know, is very hard to. I mean, we may need some conversion and other funds to make it much more potential, because Indonesia is the largest potential for geothermal, but, you know, it has not really been developed. And so these are sort of for those kinds of standard platform. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And related to this point, we have many questions from the audience about partnerships. People asking, you know, do we have, like, what are the best practices for partnership to scale up? You know, can we find tools to make partnerships successful? Any of you have any website or tools or platform to recommend, you know, to boost the successful partnership?
Maybe just one point. I think it's I mean, if we knew what the answer was, the world would probably be a better place. But I think there are some good practices out there. And we actually developed at the SDG Lab a toolkit on our experience, a modest experience, and we're only 4 years old, on how we have nurtured multi-stakeholder collaborations. And there are some elements in there. But I actually think that this is, ironically, because partnerships are, you know, in development have been going on for ages, but I think it's extremely positive that there is growing interest for that now the question is being asked, what does it actually take to partner? Because partnerships has oftentimes been used, in my view, as this sort of silver bullet for everything, right? If there's a problem, let's partner. But partnering is extremely hard sometimes, and actually it makes things often slower. It doesn't always accelerate, at least in the first instance when a partnership is being built. Once the stars are kind of aligned, of course, it allows to leapfrog in many instances. But I'm happy to see that there is more and more research and questioning around this notion of it takes more than just even a good intentions. You could have the best intentioned people around the table and still a partnership would fail, because often those questions that we talked about at the beginning, what is success for you? Who are your shareholders? Who are you accountable to? Who'll be doing your performance review? All these different issues matter in how much an individual and an institution will dedicate time and effort in going through the growing pains of any kind of partnership. So I think there's room there also for more research. There's room for sharing many more practices. I don't think it's a waste of time. In the lab, as I said, at the core of our work is all about that, is about how we can incubate meaningful partnerships by bridging the gap between very unexpected marriages, right? Really unexpected people and institutions that have never really worked together, but that are kind of flocking together around the SDGs, but are speaking apples and oranges and whatnot, yet we see that there's a potential. And how do you bring these people together around a common cause, but also to be equally satisfied or equally dissatisfied with the outcome? Hopefully it's the former, to be equally satisfied. But I think it may even be a profession of the future. I know everything is about, technology at the moment and sort of the hard tech and whatnot. But I'm a strong believer that we will continue to need people who understand people and who understand what drives a successful partnerships. Because at the end of the day, we're not partnering among robots, right? We're partnering among institutions who happen to be led by people.
Mm. I completely agree. It's what we see at the Geneva Center for Philanthropy. People start asking the question how instead of asking why first. And I think the more time you spend before the partnership, even if you decide at the end that it's not the right time or the right reason to partner, at least you take the time to know each other and to see how you can collaborate with each other. And maybe, I mentioned it very quickly, but Giuseppe, launching the DAS, a new diploma of advanced studies, is about partnership because we want to equip professionals, because we feel that there is a big appetite, to know more. And I can see that in the chat box with so many questions about partnership. There is a goodwill, but how do we do? And also the link, and I like, Cherie, when you mentioned the happiness, like something very more spiritual, but more personal, because SDG can be, so far away. And sometimes we forget about the final beneficiaries or the final markets. But I think we need to make understand people that everyone is concerned by the SDGs. And yeah.
And if I may second this, I find it also very interesting, the comment that was made, about the spiritual component, about really bringing this dimensions that sometimes when we want to reduce to SDGs, or when we think about impact investing, or bringing the logic of the markets to doing good, we frequently forget that that's what should not that's not how we actually succeed, right? It's actually the other way around. It's this should be kind of a tool that we can use, but the objective should actually be much more spiritual or emotional, if you will, dimension that is normally championed by the nonprofit sector. And sometimes when we want to do effective giving, or what's called maximize the impact, we sometimes just reduce everything to numbers, and we really lose the passion and the beauty of philanthropy, that is really a very different dimension than this kind of concrete one. So I really liked Cherie's point on this, and it's really a bell that may, an alarm bell that we should always listen to, not to reduce too much everything to the logic of markets.
I think, sorry, I was just saying I really appreciate that. And I think our forefathers, because this is an ancient wisdom of many cultures and religions, but then at some point we dropped the spiritual and changed to economics. Still there, if you look at the SDGs, the jobs, the opportunities, the economic, it's there in the bottom part of the social divide, but it shouldn't replace the spiritual. So that's not, that we went a wrong way. We have to come back to Trihita Karana, or come back to this ancient culture and philosophy.
Thank you. So I'm back to Earth a little bit because I have a question from the audience regarding blended finance. And the question is from Denilson Letayo. How can we find the best pathway in order to blend governmental finance to improve the open innovations related to the SDGs inside our country? I don't know if Renaud or Nadia. It's not an easy one, but so the best way in order to blend governmental finance to improve open innovations related to the SDGs?
I think our silence is really showing how challenging it is. So if anyone has the good solution, we are happy to hear. But I think, I mean, for us as a development agency, we focus on certain priority countries. So then there is a need from certain countries, and we have the foreign aid money we can use to help. So that's really maybe a good step. So we have some money we can use, and then the challenge is really to use our money that could be part of a big blended pot with way much more money also from the private sector. But how to do this? I think we now have some practices, some best case examples, but we also have plenty of partnerships that are struggling to know exactly how to find out the exact modalities. So I'm happy if maybe Nadia can share some of the examples in the lab, but that's really something we are tackling with different partners, and it's not that easy. I mentioned the fund, and for example, the catalytic fund would be one way, but then how you implement it, it always depends on the context, and you always have to be careful, because if you want to put an incentive, it should also not be something that you are the only one like blocking the market and destroying it. So you really have to take into account the ecosystem, and that's why it's very context specific.
I can make a general comment there, and I couldn't agree more, Renaud, that there is no silver bullet to date, because as you said, context varies so much, right? We would know that if that existed, if there were just one way of doing this. It depends on the context. Contexts are more or less risky in financial terms, are more or less risky in political terms also, and and this kind of fluctuates constantly, right? I think COVID has also demonstrated that. So I think it only shows the extent to which we need to make sure that in this financial equation, we really make sure that the stakeholders at our country level are really implicated in the conversation. That, as you were saying, the ecosystems is a very sort of in words, but I think there's no better word to say that, right? That the different actors at country level need to absolutely be in the conversation, not only to ensure that the capital is driven to where it really will make a difference, and thus that those decisions are made where it matters and not in an ivory tower somewhere in a remote city that has nothing to do with the context we're talking about. But also, if we spin it in a more positive way, so that those actors are able to explain in very concrete words how that money is going to make a difference and is going to be sustainable in the financial sense of the word too. So it's really about, you know, at our level, together with all our partners, we're working on building bridges between the finance and the development communities in this very unique ecosystem of Geneva. But this obviously has to happen at a meta level, right? And we've incubated a project called the Pipeline Builder, which is precisely trying to look at that. It's putting together the expertise of the UN in Geneva through the lab, together with the expertise of a partner organization called Ground Up that actually knows a lot, has a huge network of investors. But what we then do is, through our network of the UN, is link up with the ecosystems at country level to make sure that we're actually closing the loop. Because oftentimes what happens is that one of those variables of the equation is kind of missing, and then money is either not flowing enough or is not going to where it'll really make a difference. And we've had some amazing moments in the lab when we brought together these different communities, where you have diplomats of certain countries sitting next to investors who've been investing in a certain country for years and had never really kind of met face to face with a government representative, and having these phenomenal conversations where a diplomat is saying, well, actually, there's a sector that is really a growing sector for investments in my country, and not only can it work for money, but it's a sector that will really make a difference for our SDG priorities. So what about thinking of that sector? And those conversations and those informal conversations need to have a space to happen.
So it's a fascinating discussion. The time is running, so At least if we are not convinced yet, we know that it's an emerging topic and we need to continue the discussion. Just on behalf of the audience and myself, I would like to, and also on behalf of Trialogue, Open Geneva, UNITAR, to thank the panelists. So thank you, Cherie, thank you, Renaud, thank you, Giuseppe, thank you, Nadia, for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you also to the people behind the stage, Mallory and Aphrodite, very useful help. And I wish you the best of luck for the rest and to achieve together the SDGs, and let's keep in touch. So thank you again, and a big applause to the panelists.